On April 24th, 1964, Lonnie Zamora, a policeman in a small town out in New Mexico, would make a sighting that would change his life. That day, shortly after starting his shift, he would take off after a speeding car. Before he could even pull it over, he heard a loud roar, looking over to see what he thought was a flaming car accident in the distance. Thinking that someone might be in need of help, he abandoned the speeding car, heading straight towards all of the commotion. Upon arriving, he would see two human-looking figures in white and a large egg-shaped object with legs extending from the base. Shocked and frightened, he would watch as the craft started to rise up before shooting off across the sky. Soon after this sighting, half the police force would be out there checking out the scene and taking pictures of possible evidence. With Zamora seeming to be a credible and honest person, many government agencies as well as high-ranking officials would study this encounter looking for every possible explanation for what happened in Socorro. And now, many years later, we're able to go back and look at all the declassified files containing sketches and reports from the investigations. And this showed that even Project Blue Book would get involved, with both Dr. J. Allen Hynek and the head of the organization, Major Quintanilla, personally going out to the site themselves. The Encounter. This story starts off in Socorro, New Mexico, a small town located about an hour's drive south of Albuquerque. It's home to New Mexico Tech, a modest college, and also has a local perlite mining industry. Over the years, it's remained roughly the same size, with the population of the town never having more than 10,000 people. On April 24th, 1964, 31-year-old policeman Lonnie Zamora would be patrolling the roads on the outskirts of town. At this time, he had been an officer for about 5 years, and he was working the evening shift, coming into work around 5 p.m. Zamora had only been on duty for about 45 minutes this day when a car going noticeably too fast sped by him. Quickly chasing after him, he followed this car about half a mile outside of town. This is when Lonnie suddenly heard a loud roar from the distance. Looking over, he saw a strange bluish-orange flame rising into the air. He knew that a local mining company stored their dynamite in a shack in that direction, and at first he thought it was starting to blow up. He immediately abandoned the chase and started to drive towards this shack, radioing to the dispatcher that he was going to investigate the area. While driving down the road, he would take a few more glances at this flame, but he commented that he couldn't get the best look because he had to focus on the road. However, to him, the flame looked motionless, and it was slowly descending. It was a funnel shape, with the fire twice as wide at the bottom as it was at the top, and 4 times taller than it was wide. But Zamora couldn't tell where it was coming from. The hill in front of him was blocking much of his view. He never did see any smoke accompanying this flame, but he would see a lot of dust blowing up into the air. Going down a small gully road, he lost sight of all this briefly, but he would again hear a loud roaring sound. This time he noticed that it seemed to change frequencies, starting off high-pitched and then becoming lower before stopping altogether. Lonnie was now almost at the scene, with everything taking place just on the opposite side of the hill he was driving up. His car would get stuck in the sand, with it taking him 3 attempts to actually make it all the way up. Moving slowly, he looked around for the dynamite shack, not remembering its exact placement. It would only be about 10 or 15 seconds later that he would notice a shining object in the distance somewhere around 150 yards away. He first thought that a car had overturned and maybe the gas tank had exploded. He saw 2 smaller figures standing next to it and thought maybe they were some young drivers that had flipped their car, as neither one looked quite adult size. As he was driving closer, he thought that the car must have somehow been standing straight up on either the radiator or the trunk. The 2 figures had their back turned towards him and looked to be wearing, quote, white coveralls. At this point, he was still too far off to make out a lot of details. Then one would glance right at his car and look to be startled, jumping back somewhat. Then, going down another small hill, he would lose sight of the supposed crash and the 2 figures. Coming more inside of the whole scene, he would then stop his car just for a couple of seconds, with it now very obvious to him that this was not just a car wreck.
I got up on top of the mesa there. I looked down, and I seen this big white object on the ground.
The 2 entities had disappeared, but now he had the whole object in clear view. It was a large oval shape, which he would later describe as similar to an egg. It was very shiny, but it wasn't chrome, and had more of a white aluminum appearance. From his view, it looked to be sitting on one end with 2 slender girder-like legs extending out from the other end. He started to drive towards it again, and radioed in a possible accident, stating that he'll be busy out of the car checking out the scene and the gully. Looking back at the object, he could see that it was standing about 3 feet off the ground, and the 2 visible legs looked to be slanting outwards. Zamora would later say, "At the time, I didn't pay much attention to what it was. I thought it was an accident. I saw the 2 persons. I didn't pay any attention to the 2 legs." Whatever this object was exactly didn't matter too much to him, as he thought the 2 people next to it might be in need of help. As he pulled up to the top of the hill overlooking the gully, he stopped his car while he was still finishing up on the radio. When he got out of the car, he accidentally dropped the mic and he went to pick it up. This is when he heard 2 or 3 loud bangs a couple seconds apart, which to him sounded almost like doors closing. He stood back up and turned around just as another loud roaring sound started back up. Walking a bit closer to this source, Zamora was shocked by how loud it was. He would even say that he knew it wasn't any kind of jet engine because he had been around those before and knew what a jet engine sounded like. This time it started as a low frequency, but rose to a higher tone as it slowly got louder. Now getting a better look at everything, he would notice that no doors or windows could be seen on this oval object, and it looked to be completely smooth. He would also come to notice a strange red lettering or logo of some kind on the side. He would now see the flame at the bottom of this object. It was orange in color, but from this angle he couldn't make out much more. This egg-shaped object then started to rise slowly straight upward, with the flame on the underside kicking up a lot of dust, but not seeming to produce any kind of smoke. The roaring sound was now so loud that he thought that this object might blow up on him. He was so frightened that as soon as he saw the flame, he turned backwards, running back up the hill to his car. Glancing back after about 20 seconds, it was about level with the hill, being about 15 feet above the gully and only about 50 feet away from him. It was around this time that he noticed it actually had 4 legs and not only the 2 he had seen before. They then seemed to retract into the object. He was so distracted that he ran shin first into his fender, stumbling and dropping his glasses. But he wasn't stopping to pick them back up, deciding to leave them. Zamora thought that this object might actually be heading in his direction, so he dove behind the police cruiser, covering his head with his arms. But then he noticed that he couldn't hear the roaring sound anymore. He looked back up to see that the object was actually moving away from him. As it slowly flew off at first, it cleared the top of the dynamite shack by only about 3 feet. He then heard a sharp whining sound, similar to the roaring, before the object almost immediately took off over the empty country. It was incredibly fast, soon turning into nothing more than a speck in the sky. It then disappeared over the Box Canyon Mountains. After it took off, he never heard another sound, and again never saw any smoke or even a jet trail. At this point, there wasn't even a flame emanating from the underside. He even noted that he couldn't smell any odor from a fuel source either.
After I got to my senses, I said, did I see it or didn't I, Or what happened,
Zamora then hopped back into his car and again radioed the dispatcher, Nep Lopez. Lonnie said, "As I'm calling Nep, I could still see the object. The object seemed to lift up slowly and to get small in the distance very fast." He then asked for backup, giving directions to his location. And while he waited there, he decided to sketch down the insignia he had seen on the side of the object. He had never seen anything like it. He didn't see anything that looked to be English or anything that looked to be numbers. Just a few minutes later, Sergeant Chavez would arrive, going over to him and asking him what the trouble was. Zamora would later say, "I was sweating. He told me I was white, very pale. I asked the sergeant to see what I saw, and that was the burning bush. Then Sergeant Chavez and I went to the spot, and Sergeant Chavez pointed out the tracks." At some point, Lonnie even mentioned to the officers that it had been over a month since his last drink, and even then it was only a couple of beers. About 2 or 3 minutes after this, policemen Lucky and Pablo Lopez, as well as State Patrolman Ted Jordan, would arrive on the scene. All of these men would look over the area, with each of them having the chance to see the depressions and the smoldering plants. Altogether, they would find 6 of these depressions right where Zamora claimed to have seen the landed object. They didn't look to have been made by anything smashing into the ground either, but more like something very heavy settled on it at a low speed. 4 of these depressions were about 5 or 6 inches around, but they would also find 2 smaller tracks only about 4 inches long and more of a roundish shape. They also weren't quite as deep as the 4 others, with one officer even guessing that they were made by an individual between 120 and 160 pounds. They would also note that some of the burned plants had been green grass and the others had actually been a greasewood, which is notoriously hard to burn. Also, everything looked to have been seared all at once by an extremely hot flame. They also wouldn't see anything else in the immediate area either, with no other tracks, human or vehicle, being found. The aftermath. Just a few hours after all this happened, Zamora would be interviewed by FBI Special Agent Arthur Burns Jr. and by U.S. Army Captain Richard Holder, who was commander of the nearby White Sands Missile Range. Lonnie would give them details of the object, describing it for them and also drawing a quick sketch. When asked more about the insignia, he would comment that it looked to be about 2.5 feet tall and 2 feet wide. He was very sure that it was red in color as well. He would then draw this insignia on the object that he had sketched earlier. The FBI wanted complete secrecy at the moment, and this sketch would not be shown to the public for many years. Now we know what it looks like from these declassified documents, but at the time the public would be shown a different version. There are several theories of why the FBI might have wanted Zamora to change his drawing, but most speculate that this was done to weed out any other citizens that claimed to have seen this craft as well. So if they sketched this object for the FBI agent and it had the fabricated insignia on it, then they would know that they actually hadn't seen it for themselves. They would also briefly talk to Sergeant Chavez, asking him if it seemed like Zamora could have hoaxed this incident. But he didn't think so. He told them that Zamora was credible and hardworking, adding that he wouldn't have even had the tools to make the impressions or burn the plants.
Lonnie Zamora, he's a very dependable, honest type of person. He's not one to create or make stories or build things up to make it exciting or anything like that. He's a very well-liked type of a person.
The day after, on the 25th, Agent Burns and Captain Holder would then go out to the scene with several police officers and perform their own investigation. Agent Burns from the FBI wrote his report, basically saying that he felt that the Army and local police had the investigation covered, and that he would be leaving it to them. Chavez would then walk around the area, taking photos of the imprints as well as the location itself. The other police officers would surround the depressions with rocks in hopes of preserving them for future investigators. Unfortunately though, by Sunday afternoon that week, so many tourists had come to see them that the land had been trampled flat. So by the time they got out to look at the area, there was no evidence of any depressions or tracks even left. Although it is said that the rocks that surrounded the tracks are actually still there to this day. Although no one reported it to the Army or the FBI, at some point that day the local paper would report on another man that had actually seen a flying object. A manager of a service station just a quarter-mile away from Zamora's sighting would report that a tourist had come up to him saying that he had seen an aircraft flying at a very low height right above them. The manager would tell him that there were a few helicopters in the area, but the tourist would say, "Funny looking helicopter," if that's what it was. This is when the customer would tell the manager that it soon flew over his car, heading for the nearby gully, and then right after this he would see a police car driving on the same road right in its direction. At the time, the manager hadn't even heard of Zamora's encounter and didn't put much thought into this tourist's claim until a couple of days later when he heard the story for himself. Later that same day, KSRC Radio Network would have Officer Zamora on to talk about his encounter. The host, Mr. Schroed, would introduce Zamora as well as give a brief description on the whole event. When talking about the craft, he would say that it was an egg-shaped and that it was roughly car-sized, as that's what he thought it had been from far away. Schroed would then ask, "And was there any kind of marking on it, of any kind that you noticed?" With Zamora simply replying, "Yes, I did. Not from that far I didn't see the markings. When I got up closer to it, I did see the markings." Schroed would then comment on this saying, "And someone said that the marking you saw was an upside-down V with 3 lines running through it." However, Zamora seemed to be hiding some of the facts, saying, "No sir, I couldn't tell you that, because they still don't want me to say nothing about the markings."
Now, also, it was reported to me that when you first drove up into this area and sighted this object, that the motors were running and it was going bloot, 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 or some such sound as that. Is that correct?
I couldn't say because it happened so fast. I started running. I was scared.
Well, I don't blame you. The thoughts of it even scares me yet. Now, you did say that you saw two what appeared to be people dressed in white uniforms with, did they have helmets on like spacemen or anything?
No, sir, I wouldn't say they're people. I saw something white coverall. That's what I could say.
They looked like there was something in white coverall.
Right.
But you couldn't identify them as actually being a human being as you and I are.
No, sir, I couldn't.
You didn't know whether they turned and saw you or what then?
Well, I would say that this white object turned and saw me. Yes.
Next, the host would talk about the tourist sighting reported in the newspaper, with Lonnie actually not knowing anything about it. They would then talk more about the craft and its departure, with Zamora giving simple and straight-to-the-point answers. The host, Mr. Schroed, would then ask him, "And you can't think of anything else about the sighting of this flying object that our listening audience might be interested in?" Zamora would say, "No, that's all I can say for now." And although it's a bit hard to tell exactly what's being said in this next piece of clip, but it seems that the military actually showed up to the radio network wanting to speak to Zamora.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Mr. Lonnie Zamora. This is the gentleman, the Socorro patrolman, that Friday at around 10 minutes to 6, come upon an object, a flying object, an unidentified flying object, as the government prefers to call them.
Excuse me, Walter. I got some military people at the sheriff's office who want to talk to me now. I believe they're from UFO.
Would you have some military people that are here from UFO to talk to you right now and to ask you some more questions about this? And they have not in any way tried to indicate that they didn't want us to cover this type of a news.
No, sir. I just told them I was going to come here and talk to you on the radio station. That's all right.
Well, that's fine, and we would be interested in knowing what they think about it if they will allow it, and after you get through talking to them, if you would call us back here at KSRC and to give us some of the information that they might allow you to let us broadcast.
We'd be glad to.
All right. And Mr. Zamora, I hope that you don't come upon any more of these objects unless we find out exactly what they are.
The very next week, a number of people from other organizations would come out to do their own interviews with Zamora and Chavez. This would include James and Coral Lorenzen of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, USAAF UFO consultant Dr. Hynek, Major Connors of Kirtland Air Force Base, and Sergeant David Moody of Project Blue Book. And it's even been said that, quote, "Without exception, the interrogators were impressed with Zamora's credibility and his desire for an explanation." Zamora's reliability as a witness was actually backed by Dr. Lincoln La Paz of the University of New Mexico. Dr. La Paz was actually known around the world for his work into investigating reports of fireballs and meteorites. Although too busy to come out and help with the investigation in Socorro, he would tell them, quote, "I would first like to point out that we are not personally involved in the investigation of these unidentified flying objects. But I do want to say that I've had contacts with Mr. Zamora for 16 years in my work, and he is a thoroughly dependable observer." First Major Connor and Captain Holder would go out to the landing site with a Geiger counter, taking soil samples while searching the area. Although they didn't let anybody else get too close, some people claim that they did hear the Geiger counter going off with positive results. The Army would never discuss this publicly, classifying all of their results.
I do recall that they told me that they would develop them and send me copies of them. And it never occurred. And when I asked later about it, they told me that the film was no good. It had been ruined by radiation.
However, when approached by the media, Holder would say, "I was contacted on the evening of April 24th by local authorities and asked to provide my assistance in identifying a reported UFO. After being appraised of the situation, I attempted to determine whether White Sands Missile Range or Holloman Air Force Base had anything that might produce the conditions described. Neither White Sands Missile Range nor Holloman had an object that would compare to the object described. There was no known firing mission in progress at the time of the occurrence that would produce the conditions reported." When Major Connors was asked about the event, he would say that, quote, "He wasn't at liberty to comment." Soon, White Sands Air Force Base would even send officials an update confirming that the depressions and scorch marks had not come from any of their equipment.
Well, my first impression was that it was something from the range that needed possible help, first aid, attention, or at best security. The more I got into it, the less convinced I was that that was the case.
By Wednesday the 30th, on the week after the whole event, as part of the Air Force investigation, Dr. Hynek would fly out to the area. He would stay for a couple of days, interviewing various people and also going out to the site himself. And again, Dr. Hynek wouldn't make his report public, only telling the local newspaper, "This is one of the clearest. No, that's not the right word. Just say it's one of the soundest, best sustained reports as far as it goes. Usually one finds many contradictions or omissions in these reports. But Mr. Zamora's story is simply told, certainly without any intent to perpetuate a hoax. The story, of course, was told by a man who obviously was frightened badly by what he did see. He certainly must have seen something." There was only really one thing that would bother Dr. Hynek, and that was the lack of radar reports. He would say, "So often we have such a contact and then can trace the object to some natural phenomenon or aircraft." It seems that at some point Hynek would also make his own sketch of the insignia, attaching it to his reports, but again he wouldn't share this with the media. Although he didn't have much to say to the news outlets, he would have much more to tell the Army. Once leaving Socorro, he would begin building the dossier that would end up being nearly 200 pages long. This would be made up of notes, news articles, reports, and pictures that he would compile together. Soon it would seem that even the White House was starting to put pressure on the airbase to investigate. A telex from Wright Field to Kirtland Air Base would say that multiple different agencies wanted answers to this, and they needed them to complete the investigation immediately. The Air Force would then make a call to Project Blue Book, suggesting that they should come down and contact Zamora for more questioning. The very next day, Sergeant Moody from Wright-Patterson Air Base would be dispatched to Socorro. Moody would immediately begin his investigation upon arrival, constructing a 3-page report of the incident. He started by interviewing Chavez and then moved on to Zamora, and the details given to him matched the previous testimonies that they had made. Moody would state that the description of the craft was a bit vague and the best details were about the insignia. He wrote, "Following the interview with Sergeant Chavez, Officer Zamora was interviewed and a trip to the location made. All the persons interviewing Zamora are impressed with his sincerity and are of the belief that if a hoax has been perpetrated, Lonnie Zamora is definitely not a part of it." At the site of the encounter, Chavez would give Moody copies of the Polaroids he had taken the night of the incident. Major Connor would meet up with them, as well as 2 reporters taking statements. They would then make diagrams and take measurements of the exact landing leg depressions. There wasn't much evidence left at this point, but they would discuss what they had found with the Geiger counter. Despite what some of the rumors were saying, they actually didn't get any results at all. The radiation there was no higher than in most areas. Moody even checked the equipment against Major Connor's watch and showed that it was still working properly. Next he went out to check the local radar station, but none of them would have much to tell him. Not one of them had tracked anything flying in the sky the day of the sighting. Then he would look into the helicopters owned in the area, only coming across 2. Both of these helicopters were stationed at White Sands, but both of them were at the far end of the range and neither one of them were operational at the time. Ending his report, Sergeant Moody would write, "No conclusion as to cause could be reached by myself or Major Connor." Around this time, Dr. Hynek would also finish his report. He would present the public with a short 2-page version detailing his investigation, and at the time most people thought this was all he had to say on the topic. But his actual 8-page report would be sent back to Project Blue Book and would be classified for 20 years following this event. Acquired through the Freedom of Information Act, this longer report goes into much greater detail. Hynek first met with Major Connor at Kirtland Air Force Base. This is where he would make a call to a geologist at New Mexico Tech, Dr. La Paz, trying to convince him to go out to the site with them. Although La Paz couldn't make it, he did mention that he had worked with Zamora years prior when he was hunting for a meteorite impact location. He would also comment that Officer Zamora was a mentally healthy and completely reliable person. Now Dr. Hynek would decide to just go ahead and do some interviews before going out to the scene. He first went to the jailhouse where he would talk to Sergeant Chavez. Here Chavez would tell Hynek that Zamora was actually getting quite disgusted by all of the attention, feeling that he was being misrepresented as some kind of victim.
They stopped me all over town and wanted to know this, wanted to know that, and then I got phone calls from all over the world, and I was getting, disgusted with it.
Zamora would soon show up, ready to start his night shift. Wanting to talk to them more, Dr. Hynek took the 2 out to dinner, and they continued to talk to them for 2 more hours afterwards, also creating a sketch of the whole situation. Zamora would then go back to work, giving Dr. Hynek the chance to ask Chavez a bit more about Zamora's attitude during all of this. Chavez would tell him that Zamora actually didn't want to be interviewed anymore and only went along because he suggested that he should. Zamora would also ask him if he should go see a priest beforehand, but Chavez was unsure what to say exactly and told him it was up to him. He would also comment on the night of the incident itself, telling Dr. Hynek that at first Zamora wanted Chavez to come out there alone. When he got there, he found him badly shaken up, pale and sweaty. Chavez first said, "What's the matter, Lonnie? You look like you've seen the devil." Zamora replied, saying, "Well, maybe I have." Chavez then wanted to go check out the gully, but Zamora was reluctant, and only followed along after Chavez took the lead. It was then that they would first find the imprints left behind.
I started looking for tracks, human tracks, but the only thing I found was impressions on the ground. They were made by a perfect circle, but I found no human tracks, no shoe prints.
After discussing all of this with Dr. Hynek, they would tell him that they just really wanted to be told that it was some kind of secret Air Force device, just so they could dismiss the whole incident and move on. It was clear that Zamora was troubled over the town's reaction to the event and was somewhat disturbed by the flurry of Me Too reports now coming in. The next day, a man from the FFA met with Hynek and told him that it was quite strange that none of the nearby radars picked up anything. They were actually sensitive enough to pick up cars driving on the roads, and if something was flying in the area, it should have definitely been seen. Shortly after this meeting, Dr. Hynek and Zamora would go out to the location of the sighting, driving along the exact same route. He would again ask Zamora for more details of the event, but found his story to be actually less detailed than before. He would comment, "From that point on, his report to me was virtually identical to that he gave to Captain Holder. It is clear from this that any common object would certainly have been easily recognized. It would seem virtually incredible that any ordinary object such as a balloon, helicopter, private small plane, etc. could have remained unidentified, and further, could have caused Zamora to become as frightened as he did." It seemed to him that Zamora had become thoroughly tired of telling his story at this point. He would take a few more photos before leaving, showing the dynamite shack as well as Zamora pointing in the landing site and the direction it took off in. Unfortunately, this was about all he would see, because by the time he had gotten there, everything had already been trampled over by tourists. Neither the depressions or the bird plants could be found, but he would find a bit of charred cardboard and some ash. Wrapping up for the day, Hynek wrote, "From all of the above and from my personal observations, I would conclude the following. That Zamora, although not overly bright or articulate, is basically sincere, honest, and reliable. He would not be capable of contriving a complex hoax, nor would his temperament indicate that he would have the slightest interest in such. Overall, he felt that Zamora was a rather gruff cop that was really just doing his job. Hynek would even hear him complain that he hadn't met his quota of giving tickets because of all the UFO commotion. He then wrote, "It appears essential that we discover what the physical object actually was. It is clear that the UFO aficionados are going to make a great case of this one. No doubt was left in my mind, but the NICAP and the APRO, and possibly others, would consider this the best authentic landing site on record. They will use it, very likely as a lever for congressional investigation, and will deride any attempt to explain it away as a balloon, conventional helicopter, etc." But Dr. Hynek actually felt that this case was very important. He said that he would require the Secretary of the Air Force to go over secret planes with him so that he could rule anything out he could. He then went on to question Zamora many more times on the shape of the craft and the insignia, but he never got any more information that wasn't already in Holder's report. He would also interview Agent Burns from the FBI, who confirmed a couple of things for him. The agent had the opinion that the tracks and scorched plants were indeed fresh when he went out to investigate. And although Zamora was the only one to see the object, a total of 9 people had seen the evidence afterwards. Burns, however, commented that he didn't know how reliable of a person Zamora was, as he just didn't really know much about him. Hynek then questioned Dr. Hack Wathman, president of the New Mexico School of Mines, who said he knew nothing of geological or other types of experiments going on in the area at that time. Dr. Hynek commented, "Not one person whom I talked to in the least, by either implication or innuendo, challenged Zamora's veracity." Before leaving Socorro, he would even contact the mother of a girl in the nearby area that claimed to have stared at a UFO too long and burned her eyes. He then contacted the doctor of this girl and would confirm that she was treated for eye burns and the doctor wasn't positive on what had caused them. With pretty much everyone questioned and the site completely investigated, he wrapped up his report. He said that it was a pity that no pictures had been taken and that the radars hadn't picked anything up. He also commented that Zamora could have been a better observer and more articulate during the interviews. Overall, though, he was quite impressed with this case. If the object was from this world, then it must have been some secret device that was undergoing testing. He recommended finding the device if it exists and bringing it out to the sighting location under the same conditions. Only by doing this could they tell whether or not it matched the object described by Zamora. It seems that once Dr. Hynek left, much of the commotion died down and no new information would come out for several years. In 1968, Dr. James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona, claimed to have knowledge of fused sand being found at the event site. He claims that an unnamed woman working as a chemist with the Public Health Services in Las Vegas contacted him one day. She apparently was involved with taking the soil samples during one of the first investigations on April 25, 1964, and she's said to have seen a patch of melted and solidified sand right under the landing site. McDonald and this mysterious chemist would then meet up in person where she told him about some of the other analysis that they had performed on the plants. She said to him, "There were a few organic materials they couldn't identify, but most of the sample was just sap." She would then claim that shortly after she finished her work, quote, Air Force personnel came and took all of her notes and materials and told her she wasn't to talk about it anymore. The official analysis of the plant matter was never given out to the public, but the soil sample report would be declassified later on in the 80s. It doesn't seem that they found anything unusual, with the conclusion simply reading, "There's apparently no significant differences in elemental composition between the different samples." From this point onward, Lonnie Zamora would rarely agree to any interviews, but he wouldn't deny that it all happened either. However, in February 1996, an author, Chris Lambright, did claim to have a phone interview with him, uncovering a few more details. He would then send Zamora several sketches. They showed the object in various positions and asked him to mark the most correct one. The last sketch showed different configurations of the symbol seen on the side of the object, and this was what Lambright thought was the most interesting part. Even over 30 years later, there is still quite a bit of confusion over what the symbol actually looked like. Most times, Zamora had only ever given a spoken description of the insignia. This leads Lambright to believe that the multiple discrepancies come from these different sources sketching their own version. Chris would write, "There does appear to be some support for believing that the symbol that was widely circulated early on may have actually been a variation of the true one. The idea that investigative personnel from the Air Force or other governmental agencies may have circulated a substitute as a way to guard against copycat reports have some merit." Common theories. In the years since Zamora's encounter, two main theories keep popping up again, with each version announced like it was a new thought or discovery. But actually, they're the same theories that were written down in the official reports all those years ago. The first and most commonly believed idea is that Lonnie saw some kind of experimental vehicle being tested. Nowadays, many people believe that he could have seen a prototype of the lunar lander module during its initial stages of development. However, the second most believed story is that this was all just a hoax. If not made up by Zamora, then made up by somebody else setting him up. But fortunately for us, both of these hypotheses have been thoroughly looked into at this point. Experimental lunar craft. Interestingly enough, the theory that Zamora had seen a moonlander prototype actually originated with one of Dr. Hynek's proteges, Jacques Vallée. One day, Vallée wrote a note that started this whole argument. This note read as, "In the meantime, the Air Force continues to look into a curious fact I have uncovered. The insignia seen by Patrolman Zamora looks very much like the logo of Astropower, a subsidiary of the Douglas Aircraft Corporation. I found the logo in an ad they recently published in an engineering journal. I am suspicious of this aspect of the sighting. To my knowledge, there has never been a genuine report of a saucer with an insignia painted on the side. Could the Socorro object be a military prototype? And although it's never said exactly who it was, someone did look into this idea. An extensive investigation was performed and a list was drawn up of all the major lunar vehicle subcontractors. The Apollo mission had actually contracted several different companies to try to come up with the best lunar lander. They would then send out letters and other inquiries to each one of these companies, obtaining the details of each prototype location and the testing dates. And in the end, they would completely dismiss the idea that it had all been a lunar lander test. Back in 1964, there was actually only one working prototype, and it was over 550 miles away at Edwards Air Force Base. Further looking into all this, it was found that the first test flight didn't even happen until October that year, a full 6 months after Zamora's encounter. Another experimental vehicle that is often suggested is the Surveyor Lunar Lander prototype, which was actually being tested at Holloman Air Force Base directly adjacent to White Sands. In 2006, the group New Mexicans for Science and Reason would come forward with a log they had found in declassified information from Holloman. This log shows a test flight that actually happened on the same day as the sighting. However, even with this find, there are still problems that come with it. For one, it's important to note that Holloman was over 90 miles away from Socorro. Another issue would be that according to the log, the test had ended a full 6 hours before Zamora had even made his sighting. And although there were multiple different looking Surveyor prototypes and mock-ups, none of them came close to matching the description of the flying object. The problems go on, too. Although the lunar lander was self-launching, the Surveyor was not. The logs clearly indicate that helicopters were used to lift these crafts during their tests. Zamora originally reported hearing a loud roar accompanied by flames, and even saw the object fly off. It seems that the Surveyor wasn't capable of doing any of this. Most also believe that Zamora most likely would have recognized the sounds of helicopter blades, which also just don't sound like what he described. Looking back, some have found that Captain Holder, the man in charge of White Sands, had actually contacted Holloman at one point during his initial investigation. The telex mentioned earlier even stated the White House was pressuring the Air Force to investigate. To most, it just seems unlikely that any vehicle was so secret that 2 separate air bases felt the need to hide it from that many organizations. It was all a hoax. The second most widely believed theory has also been around since the very beginning. When Zamora's report was first published in the paper, many townsfolk thought it must have been some kind of hoax. And they wouldn't be the only ones. As news spread, many people around the country would try to debunk this story in a number of ways, but none were very successful. However, more recently, this theory was revived once again when a staff member at New Mexico Tech found a letter dated 1968 between the then president of the college, Dr. Sterling Colgate, and a Dr. Linus Pauling. The letter is fairly standard until you get to the handwritten PS message. Here, Dr. Pauling writes a brief description of Zamora's sighting as well as asking Dr. Sterling's opinion on the whole ordeal. Sterling replied with, "I have a good indication of the student who engineered hoax. Student has left. Cheers." Shortly after discovering this letter, Dr. Sterling would be contacted for questions. Many years later, he still stood by this statement. When asked for more details, Sterling said, "I will ask a friend, but he and other students did not want their cover blown." Although nothing has ever came of this, other staff members and students at New Mexico Tech have also heard tales of the previous students conducting this hoax way back then. Some of the more popular stories even include a, quote, rear projection device that was somehow even used in direct daylight. Unfortunately, none of these stories have any evidence or proof or any names to give investigators more to look into. Soon after this letter was discovered, another letter from 1965 would be found again discussing the likelihood of a hoax. This time between previously mentioned Dr. Hynek and a Harvard professor and amateur debunker, Dr. Donald Menzel. These letters would apparently start when Dr. Menzel suggested that the Socorro incident was all a hoax performed by high school students. He said, "The whole thing could have easily been planned to come off as it did." He would make other claims, like stating that Zamora didn't have a regular patrol route, so his approximate location couldn't be verified at the time of the sighting. Menzel also suggested that when Zamora lost his glasses, he could have somehow mistaken the dynamite shack for some flying object. He didn't believe that Lonnie had created the hoax himself, but he did think that it was very possible that this was done to prank him and was performed by high school students or a, quote, local UFO club. Menzel comments on the cardboard found on the scene, saying that the hoaxers could have also made a cardboard spaceship, hid it behind the hill, and then launched it with some kind of balloon right before Zamora arrived. He adds that they could have also even triggered blasts of flames before, quote, running like hell. On April 29, 1965, Dr. Hynek decided to respond to these suggestions made by Dr. Menzel, writing quite a lengthy letter rebuking his claims. He would even enclose a piece of cardboard that he still had from the investigation the year prior. Hynek would say that he found it under a bush, but the Air Force took the only pieces with charred edges. But either way, he would point out that the cardboard was much too flimsy and not at all the kind you would use to make a model spacecraft. He would also add that the cardboard was likely unconnected to the sighting, as he also found old lunchboxes, random papers, and other trash blowing around the scene. Dr. Hynek would even discuss this whole matter with Major Hector Quintanilla, the director of Project Blue Book, saying that they had both agreed that this was not a hoax. He would go on to present some of the information he had gathered in an unbiased manner. Hynek admitted that Zamora may not have seen a flame and it could have just possibly been some sort of dust swirl. And although there were burned plants, no one ever claimed to see anything burning or saw any smoke. However, at the time, Chavez apparently insisted that only parts of the hard-to-burn greasewood were seared and only in highly localized places, noting that the nearby areas looked completely untouched. To Hynek and Major Quintanilla, there was no way this was caused by, quote, Hollywood flames. He was also shown the analysis of the plants taken earlier by the military, with Quintanilla writing to him, laboratory analysis of the burned brush showed no chemicals that could have been propellant residue. Dr. Hynek would next add that the police officers and FBI both testified that they had found no other tracks in the immediate area. Hynek wrote, "It is Quintanilla in my opinion that both Chavez and FBI agent Burns must have been in on the hoax if we adopted the hoax hypothesis." He also feels that they would have found something used in the hoax as well, especially if they had to make a run for it, although nothing but trash was ever found. Going on, he notes that the wind was blowing strongly from the south that day, with the craft being said to have flown west, something a large balloon could not do. Hynek added that there was indeed enough room behind the hill to hide if you laid prone, but not so much room to hide everything else involved. He would even get in touch with a high school student from Socorro who worked at the service station where the tourist was said to have seen something flying over his car. This student would say that they all hated the, quote, fuzz, but if they wanted to get revenge on Zamora, they would probably do something much more simple. He added that it was much more likely that they would just beat him up or let all the air out of his tires. This high schooler really doubted that any of his classmates would immediately jump to a hoax of that level. At this point in the letter, Hynek would also add that although they tried to find this tourist, they never actually found any evidence that he even existed, thinking that it may have just been a Me Too report. But if this tourist did exist, then they would have to be in on the hoax as well. He goes on to say that in his opinion, it's very unlikely that a hoax of this caliber could go on for so long. Hynek believes that the perpetrator would have said something eventually, or they never would have gotten their recognition for pulling one over on Officer Zamora. Giving an example, Hynek then tells a story mentioned to him by the previously named Dr. La Paz. He had told him that just a few years prior to this whole incident, a real hoax would occur with him as the target. One student apparently drove to a distant part of the state where he and a few friends would plant a meteorite, telling Dr. La Paz that they had seen it falling and chased it down. This hoax lasted all of a week before the rumors were flying all around the college. The students were then quickly tracked down and expelled from school because they simply couldn't keep a secret. He would even question the FBI agent, as well as Chavez and Zamora again, on some of these statements, making sure he had all of his information correct. Hynek even specifically asked them if they had seen any rope, gas tanks, or anything else that could have been used to launch a model into the sky. And they all stood by their previously stated details, confirming that they had found nothing like that and there had been no track suggesting that anyone or any equipment had been there. Hynek would also hear from Chavez that there actually was no local UFO club like Dr. Menzel had claimed. He also adds that Zamora's description stated that it looked to be about the size of an overturned car, meaning that the model would have had to be quite large, making it a lot harder to hide and then launch. He also adds that when you go to the site yourself, you can see that an incoming car couldn't be noticed until it got to the hill overlooking the gully. Hynek just doesn't believe that this would be enough time for pranksters to launch a model, set off bursts of fire, and then drag it all away. Further ripping into Dr. Menzel, Hynek would tell him to remember that Zamora had not even lost his glasses until after he had seen the first object. And then he had only seen it without the glasses when it was flying away. Hynek wrote, "Your suggestion that we reenact the event is more difficult than you think. I've not yet discovered how to make a balloon go off crosswind or to wait to release it and cause an explosion until someone was just 100 feet away from me and then disappeared and hide instantaneously. If the purported balloon release had been by means of delay mechanisms with the hoaxers having time to hide, then the release mechanisms or part of it would have been left behind as telltale evidence." Dr. Hynek continues, explaining that Zamora hasn't been having the best of time around town since this encounter. At one point, Lonnie stopped a local teen for speeding, who would say to him, "What are you giving me a ticket for? Don't you know a flying saucer might come down on you any minute?" Hynek thinks that this is a natural remark for someone trying to ridicule someone else for seeing a UFO, but he does also comment that not everyone around town necessarily feels this way. Sergeant Chaffez remarks several times that in all the years working with Zamora, he had never seen him in anything at all approaching the state he was in when he joined him that day. Hynek would write, "I honestly don't think a small gas-filled balloon carrying a cardboard spaceship could have frightened a gruff, practical type like Zamora, who is used to accidents, bloodsheds, fights, and even murders. We all seem to agree that Zamora saw something that really and truly frightened him." Hynek thinks that it's much more likely that Zamora saw some kind of strange test aircraft that was just beyond secret, adding that this still doesn't have good reasoning, because if it was that secret, why would they land it just half a mile outside of town? He wonders if all these various agencies really failed to unearth any classified clues during all their investigations. He ends this letter by writing, "I find it impossible to dismiss as a hoax unless we have some evidence that there was a hoax." Even 2 years after the whole encounter and following investigation, Major Quintanilla still felt quite puzzled over this case. In a classified CIA publication, Quintanilla mentioned that with the help of many other agencies, they had conducted an exhaustive check of military activities. This was done in an attempt to find an explanation for what happened in Socorro, but they never did find anything that matched the sighting. Declassified on January 2nd, 1981, this publication titled, "Studies in Intelligence," uses the Socorro case as an example of an encounter that just can't be explained. Quintanilla wrote, "There is no doubt that Lonnie Zamora saw an object which left quite an impression on him. There is also no question about Zamora's reliability. He is a serious police officer, a pillar of his church, and a man well versed in recognizing airborne vehicles in his area. He is puzzled by what he saw, and frankly, so are we. This is the best documented case on record, and we have still been unable, in spite of thorough investigation, to find the vehicle or other stimulus that scared Zamora to the point of panic." Interestingly, it's said that before investigating the Socorro case, Dr. Hynek was actually quite skeptical of encounters with aliens and UFOs. After discovering many unsettling facts about Zamora's report, he slowly started to change his mind over the years. As for what happened to Lonnie himself, it's a bit questionable. Some news reports claim that he took so much ridicule from the other officers and local community that he quit the force just 2 years after the event, going on to work at a local service station. However, other articles claim that he continued to work for the police for 8 more years before being offered the position as the town's landfill manager, which he ended up accepting. But it is known that he was unwilling to discuss the case further. Zamora says that he really just doesn't want to talk about UFOs anymore. He refused most interviews for decades before passing away in 2009. Even now, few sightings have ever gained this much attention from this many government agencies. And to this day, the Socorro incident is listed as unidentified in the Air Force files.
I believe Lonnie Zamora was a good policeman and an honest man who reported as he thought proper something well beyond his experience.
Thanks again for watching, everyone, and please leave a like and subscribe if you like this type of content. And be sure to leave a comment, I'm always interested in hearing your guys' thoughts as well. And this is still Tier 3 of our alien abduction and incident iceberg. I'm just slowly going through it to make sure I get all the detail in there. And before I go, I should also mention this video is available in podcast form as well, and that's on most podcast platforms. For any of you wanting to show support, I have opened up a Patreon and a channel membership where you can get videos early and ad-free. This was Matt, and I want to believe.